When this game was first presented to me in an email, I was immediately intrigued by the premise: mounted combat with flying mounts. Hoping to fill the Dragon's Prophet-sized void left in my soul, a few months had passed until I had access to the beta, which due to NDA restrictions meant I couldn't do a side quest on it. The game held my interest well enough, while the rest in Grindstone who joined me were not as enthused, but I was still looking forward to being able to do the game as a full episode. What I didn't realize is just how much more public interest this game seemed to have. When I streamed this game on Twitch, I was wondering why chat was starting to get so active with so many names that I didn't recognize, until I noticed that my viewers had tripled while I was playing this game. For comparison, I streamed the recently released game Inside on the day it launched on Steam, and it barely broke double digits. And now, I'll get to see if that level of interest is still around. This is the MMO Grinder, and it's time to look at Riders of Icarus. Riders of Icarus is a fantasy-styled world MMO developed by We Made Entertainment, and published by, yes, Nexon. I know I have a reputation with Nexon, and they have theirs, but I oddly enough had a contact within the game who graciously offered me not only the beta key, but a head start access offered up by a Founders Pack, which allowed me to get a bit more time into working on the game before the video was released. Which was then completely interrupted by my gym time, the release of Pokemon Go, Dresker's computer destroying itself, and Kurochi burning out on the game almost immediately. Fun times all around. Riders of Icarus is touted for its main draw of the aforementioned mounted combat, as well as the concept of beast taming and collection, to be used as mounts, pets, or even stat boosters. Though, with the rest of the game fitting a far more normal-feeling World MMO experience, will this main draw be enough to pull you in? Let's find out. Like our last review, the game will hit you over the head with the fact that it was made in CryEngine. Some of the key differences are that it doesn't state which version of the engine it's using, and most importantly, it actually looks like it could have been done in this engine. There are some graphical glitches and technical hiccups, one in which Dresker was found that the world's textures were unloading and giving him a wireframe view of everything. Kurochi could jump and get his camera to view entire new worlds, and Dobar and I had instances where story areas wouldn't load and forced the game to restart. On the whole, though, graphic-related issues are to a minimum. The game looks very basic, though. The aesthetic does the job, but there isn't anything mind-blowing on display, with exceptions to some pretty flashy portal effects. This extends to the UI, which gets the point across that it needs to. It isn't overblown or stylish. There are some odd choices, like placing the priest motes in the top left under the health and stamina, but these are to a minimum as well. A major issue is that the game can be rather unstable, fluctuating in frame rate and load times dramatically. This doesn't seem to be affected by the number of players or monsters around, so we can't say for sure what actually causes it. There are just times and places where the game will just tank in performance, perhaps indicating poor optimization, but this is still early into the game's launch as they're still going with that open beta tag. There won't be too much to say in this section, as it's all very standard and safe. There weren't any music tracks that really stood out, and you could be forgiven for thinking that this is yet another title where there isn't any music, because it doesn't really play very often. The sort of generic fantasy soundscape carries into the sound effects, as nothing sounds terrible, but nothing sounds amazing either, and it all works, but it's as standard as you can imagine. Voice clips tend to annoy some people though, especially the mages, who speak in this kind of faux Latin, yelling various words like Ignis, Flay, and Liat when casting spells. Though the game does well to offer up quite a few different clips for each spell type, meaning that certain spell types get a few words to cast them, which I personally feel is a neat touch, but it certainly annoyed the hell out of my Twitch chat, and it does get repetitive very quickly during long combat sessions. It's a polarizing deal. Voice acting is few and far between, but it is pretty solid and middle of the road all around, with no performance standing out as fantastic, but definitely not terrible. The character creator is a rather robust system, though it won't compete against the most freeform systems out there. You still do get a lot of choice. Kurochi managed to make himself a dwarf, so that's something. Though the childlike faces will become incredibly creepy when seen on fully muscled adults. Basically, if you want to make an unholy abomination against nature, knock yourself out. There are no races to choose from, but the variety on display from the character creator can make up for that shortcoming. With no racial choices, there is no racial class locking either, which is a huge plus, though there aren't a lot of class choices, with only 5 to choose from, which are as follows. The Berserker, a melee class focusing on two-handed weapons and lots of AoE. The Guardian, a sword and board class focusing on tanking and buffs. The Assassin, a squishy class with lots of combos and wielding twin daggers. The Priest, a healing class based around motes of power and tossing them out as heals. And the Wizard, your typical master of elemental fury with a focus on fire and ice magic. Once you're happy with your character and your class choices, you'll be taken to the game's tightly scripted tutorial sequence, in which you're tasked with escaping an enemy prison. You'll be forgiven if you get ESO flashbacks. This is also where you'll choose your combat style, either the typical tab targeting system, which will benefit mostly the Priest, Wizard, and Guardian, or the action style, which will benefit the Assassin and Berserker. Keep in mind that the action style feels rather tacked on to a degree, that players of the Secret World will be very familiar with. It also doesn't help that while you can technically move while fighting, a lot of attacks will have animations that alert you to a complete halt to perform before being able to move. But at least some of them were given minor changes from the game's beta, meaning that the Assassin isn't as awkward to play. You can even dodge enemy projectiles and attacks, though the melee ones seem incredibly finicky, and the ranged attacks will feel more dodgeable if you yourself are a ranged class. Playing one of the ranged classes will highlight one of this game's more welcome features, the fact that loot drops will land at your feet instead of where the enemy died, meaning that you can always reach it. This even extends to the game's mounted aerial combat, meaning that if you kill an aerial target while being in the air yourself, a special floating loot bag will spawn on top of you for you to gather that loot. Of course, there is that mounted combat option within the game, which will tie into the game's mount and pet system. When you're mounted, and once you've earned the appropriate skills to add to your mounted hotbar, you can either use a crossbow or a lance to attack while mounted. You can even cast some abilities of your class while mounted, but these will vary wildly depending on which class you actually chose. The issue with the mounted combat is that it can feel rather awkward, at least when you're using the crossbow, which feels very lackluster to use. The same can't be said about the lance, which not only feels really good to use, but comes across with a lot of varied combos and chains to work into, and several more abilities that the crossbow just doesn't have, and it allows you to tailor your fighting to the situation instead of just spamming the exact same thing over and over. The real shame of the system is that they put so much emphasis on taming monsters, and yet we've seen this before in Dragon's Prophet. That comparison doesn't do Riders of Icarus any favors, as the system is almost all RNG, meaning you'll either capture it or you'll just get tossed off the mount at the whim of a dice roll. It's only made easier by your comparative level or having specific items to tame with. Whereas in Dragon's Prophet, you had direct control over taming a creature, playing a minigame that varied in difficulty depending on the dragon that you were trying to tame. With more reliance on sheer dumb luck to tame creatures in Riders of Icarus, you can become easily frustrated while constantly being thrown off, and there doesn't seem to be any physical way to counteract it. It doesn't help that there are quests that will ask you to tame specific monsters, which also means that everyone else is trying to do the same thing. And given that it's random, you shouldn't be surprised that there are camping parties for set mobs. Once you do successfully capture a creature, assuming that it isn't one of the random ones that's labeled as untamable, it'll be instantly converted into a mount and take up an inventory slot within your mount system. Space can be increased by using the game's currency known as Alloons, which can be earned by completing achievements or purchasing it from the cash shop. Once you have a mount within your storage, you can set it to active to use as a mount, which will then let it earn experience to increase its health, speed, and endurance while allowing higher tiers of equipment to be added. You also have the option of turning them into combat pets, which will give buffs and help them fight as well. But this requires using a special item known as a pet scroll. Do note this odd choice that when you turn a creature into a pet, its icon will change to a more, well, let's just say super kawaii version. This brings us to the game's questing system, which is about as bog standard as you can get. You have your typical World of Warcraft mentality of questing hubs where you'd gather up everything, perform your kill X to gather Y, gather X, escort X to Y, etc., before returning from a group of quests to turn them all in and move on to the next hub. Really, the game is incredibly linear, very much the idea of a theme park, but it does manage to open up more by the end, just don't expect too much exploration. A rather unfortunate little quirk of the game is that the spawn rate has been geared up, and while this does alleviate some of the issues of a popular new release, you can often find yourself caught by enemies respawning right on top of you. In a typical MMO, you'd be given a brief window where the enemy has respawned, but their AI has yet to become active. In Riders of Icarus, this is not the case, as the moment they spawn, if they're hostile, they will immediately target you. It can be a major issue if you play a class with poor defense, and we do hope that they'll iron this particular feature out some more. Fitting with a theme of typicality, you have a rather standard crafting system, but with a few twists on it. The main twist is that you don't go to the next tier of crafting by just making large amounts of items, but instead you make enough to earn mastery of an item. Each tier then requires a certain number of items to be mastered before you can move on. So, for example, you could master smelting iron ingots and making daggers, and then get to the next tier to make better staves. There's a bit of grinding when it comes to making the items for mounts in the form of essences, but this is a rather straightforward crafting system that can make some rather useful and helpful items if you take advantage of it. Out of the gate, we need to talk about the elephant in the room. If you end up in a questing area where there are a ton of players, there will be a very, very noticeable FYGM attitude running throughout the game, and it's mostly the game's own fault for fostering it. Oftentimes, when you're set to fight a boss monster, you'll notice other players hovering around it, waiting, wanting you to start combat so that they can try to mount the boss and claim it, or trying to steal items and crafting nodes from underneath you while you're engaged in combat. Part of this is because those bosses are rare and powerful mounts that not only look interesting and unique, but will give nice benefits over using a standard rarity mount. This also means that people will often camp out these spawn locations, and regardless of whether or not you have a quest to fight it or defeat it, well, screw you, they want a mount, so you just wait your turn, cupcake. Fortunately, you can ease your worries by joining up with friends to form parties, which will actually give you a buff to the drop rate and your experience earned, as well as helping in some quests. We say some quests because it seems arbitrary if you'll share credit with others in your party, or if everyone just needs to complete it for themselves. This won't stop people from stealing resource nodes or fighting to steal a boss's amount before you can defeat them for a quest, but at least it makes the usual grind through the game a bit more tolerable. Thankfully, there are very few limitations for forming a guild as well. If you have 2 gold in your pockets, congratulations, you can form a guild. It's a welcome stance on guilds as it allows people to quickly set up a group for them and their friends to use them, without the worry of needing X number of people in a group online at one time. The game does follow a standard dungeon formula with plenty of quests for those dungeons. They are, thankfully, pretty short. And while they aren't all that amazing, they get the job done and make for a good grinding distraction if you want to farm up for some better gear and get some better rewards. They also, thankfully, offer up solo modes, so you're never forced to find a group just to continue your quest line. While the cash shop at first seems pretty standard, you'll quickly find that the oddest quirk is that most of the game uses these alloons to purchase items, which in turn are purchased with Nexon's NX, making alloons a cash currency that you purchase with cash currency. You can earn alloons in-game, but at a painfully slow rate with heavy amounts of grinding, so you're best off purchasing them here if you plan on getting anything substantial. Bag space can be a nightmare in this game, and made worse by the very distant and rather pathetic bags that are offered up to you as you level. The shop contains a 16-slot bag for 50 alloons, which isn't a bank-breaking amount, but you do need to purchase them in a far larger chunk if you want them, and if you didn't get any from a premium or founder's pack bonus. If you're expecting a plethora of costumes to make up for this game's oddly samey-looking armor sets, you'll find the shop lacking in that department. In fact, there's all of 6 costumes, 3 pairs of recolors, including one that looks suspiciously like a World War II German soldier. I feel like a game with limited armor variants could benefit from a deeper costume selection, so here's hoping they offer up a lot more in the future. In fact, beyond your cash shop currency, alloons are used in-game to unlock more space for your mounts at a slightly increasing price each time you open a new slot, starting with a paltry 7 alloons and increasing by a few alloons each time. You'll burn through your alloons really fast if you aren't willing to let your pets go, or at least convert them into stat boosters. Of course, the one thing you cannot purchase with alloons, giving NX a separate usage, is premium time, with the limited amounts of 30, 60, and 180 days. They're basically paid subscription time and offer up basic bonuses, like experience boosts and discounts to in-game services like the auction house. But I honestly think you'll be hard-pressed to need them, but they do go for slightly cheaper than I'd expect them to, so it's an option at least. While you might not have seen the footage in the review, I did reach the level cap in the beta, and in this version of the game, Dobar ended up reaching the level cap as well, and he confirms that the game doesn't really change up anything in the final stages. If you're into the monster collection, you might really have a blast with this. Dedicated players can reach cap in a matter of days, and there's plenty to do if you're looking to improve your character and your beast collection. However, plenty others have pointed out that this game feels like it would have been the breakout success of 2010, but many of the game's tropes feel half a decade too late for some people. I feel it's a better balance of old and new than Asta was, but there's still plenty of others who are likely burnt out on the World MMO staples. Here's my final rating. I place this here because it's clear from the get-go that this game wanted this to be a main feature. While you might run into the occasional untamable creature that would normally be something you could tame, the majority of this game's beasts are rideable or trainable pets waiting to be captured, even going as far to allow each class mounted weaponry and class-specific skills while on Dragonback. With as many systems in place for this kind of feature, it's definitely the game's main draw, and will likely be most of the reason that people will hop in. In fact, the gotta-catch-em-all attitude might run high in fans of this game, looking to capture pets and tweak their abilities to best suit their needs. Or just have a nice collection of pets and mounts to show off in a newbie zone. The quick dash to the level cap almost makes it seem like this was the entire point. Despite the fact that a classic formula isn't the most groundbreaking design choice, it's at least a familiar design choice. And those looking to play something that won't be too far out of their comfort zone might find a good home here. It's a game that really banks on a classic gameplay feel, but still ditching tired tropes like the trainer NPCs, altering the way combat feels to seem a bit more rewarding to movement, making travel and mounts easy to use, and having crafting feel more rewarding than usual in these kinds of games. In a game based around collecting mounts and pets, of course the pet slots are limited, and as shady as that seems, regular players of the game will just find themselves likely swapping out one ground mount, one flying mount, and one pet at the most. So if you find the urge to collect them, you will need to spend alloons to grant more slots. Speaking of limited space, your bags will fill up fast with the sheer amount of stuff this game will drop on you. Alloons might be better spent on the 16 slot bags available, as they'll serve you far better than the few 8 slot bags you'll gain from quests as you level up. If you don't want to drop the cash, some of the repeatable quests offer up alloons as a reward, but you'll be grinding the hell out of them to gain a respectable amount. I know I just said that players are clamoring for a classic formula, and they might find this game ideal, but there are a lot of people who are not. Those completely jaded by the standard gameplay will likely burn out on this title fast. The mount system is slightly more unique, but not entirely original, and certainly not a game changer unless you're really into it. In fact, the changes made to combat designed to switch up the standard hack formula aren't exactly consistent. I thought it was pretty cool the first time I was able to dodge a projectile just by moving out of the way, but melee characters don't tend to get this advantage, and in general, being in melee range will still cause enemies to damage you with air swipes. Your character will feel oddly fragile if you're not on the ball to dodge everything, and God help you if you end up solo fighting more than 2 enemies at a time at later levels. Achieved in CryEngine, and at least this time, I can believe it. But with that in tow, lower-end computers are probably going to have an issue running this game, and that'll leave them right out of playing, regardless of how they feel about the game in general. It's certainly not the most high-end game, but it's a lot more so than a lot of free-to-play MMOs, so be wary of that if you want to give this a spin. Next time, I'll actually look at the game I said I was going to look at in the last episode. Things happened, is all. Once again, thanks for sticking around to the end of the credits to hear me ramble on about whatever the hell I'm saying. It's almost like the same thing every time. Click on the window to the left, it'll take you to the last review on Asta, which is a game that's kind of similar in this sense of being a game that you've probably played before, except way more WoW clone-y. I wasn't that much of a fan, but it's got its merits. If you click on the window on the right, it'll take you to my Pokemon Go side quest, and yes, it's a mobile game. And yes, it's not really an MMO, but Jesus Christ, is this thing, like, super popular. Just go ahead and check it out if you've ever had any interest in the game or just tired to see all the signs hanging up around your neighborhood. Once again, I want to give a big shout out to Main Street Computers for helping me and Dresker out with his whole computer issue recently. So if you live in northern Delaware or are just extremely bored, you can check out the info on the card I just put up there, as well as links in the description. Speaking of links in the description, once again, Slipstream's still paying for it, so I might as well be plugging his podcast. If you head on over to NoTokensRequired.com, you can check out his main website, as well as his Twitch stream over at twitch.tv/NoTokensRequired.